I was standing in my backyard, admiring the greenhouse. I had just finished building when I saw her marching across my lawn like she owned the place. Margaret Henderson, the HOA president of Willow Creek Estates in Boulder, Colorado, was the kind of woman who probably complained about rainbows for not following proper color distribution guidelines. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair didn't move despite the afternoon breeze, and her pinched expression suggested she smelled something perpetually offensive. "Wayne Owens," she barked, not bothering with pleasantries. "What is that monstrosity in your backyard?" I turned to look at my greenhouse, a beautiful 16 by 24-foot structure with aluminum framing and polycarbonate panels. I had designed it myself, ensuring every measurement met not just HOA requirements, but exceeded state and county building codes. It sat on a proper concrete foundation, positioned exactly 22 feet from my property line, well beyond the required 15-foot setback. "It's a greenhouse, Margaret, for growing vegetables and starting seedlings." Her nostrils flared. "I don't care what it is. It's an eyesore and it's against HOA regulations. You didn't get approval from the Architectural Review Board." I took a deep breath, counting to 5 in my head. "Actually, I submitted my application 6 weeks ago. Complete with engineering drawings, structural calculations, and material specifications. The board approved it unanimously." "I don't recall seeing any such application." "That's because you missed the last 3 board meetings," I said calmly. "Your Vice President, Tom, mentioned you were on vacation in Sedona." Margaret's face turned an impressive shade of crimson. "That's beside the point. This structure is clearly in violation of Section 12, Paragraph 4 of our HOA guidelines regarding auxiliary structures. Section 12, Paragraph 4 specifically addresses structures over 200 square feet that require separate utility connections. My greenhouse is 384 square feet, yes, but it doesn't have separate utilities. It uses my existing home water connection for the irrigation system and relies entirely on natural light. No electrical, no plumbing separate from the main house." She crossed her arms, her designer handbag swinging with the motion. "We'll see about that. I'm calling code enforcement. They'll tear this thing down, and you'll be liable for all violations. You do what you need to do, Margaret." She spun on her heel and stomped back across my lawn, pulling out her phone before she even reached the sidewalk. I watched her go, shaking my head. What Margaret didn't know, what she hadn't bothered to research before starting this little crusade, was that I wasn't just some random homeowner who built a greenhouse. I was a senior building code specialist for the state of Colorado Department of Local Affairs. I had spent the last 8 years literally writing and revising the state building codes that every municipality, including Boulder County, had to follow. That evening, my wife Lisa came home from her shift at the hospital. She found me in the greenhouse, transplanting tomato seedlings into larger pots. "How was your day?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. Margaret stopped by. Lisa groaned. "What now?" She's calling code enforcement on the greenhouse. "But we got approval. We did everything right." "I know. She's just mad because she wasn't personally involved in approving it. You know how she gets when she feels like she's lost control of something." Lisa walked over and examined the tomato plants. "These are looking good. What are you going to do about Margaret?" "Nothing. Let her call code enforcement. They'll come out, inspect it, find everything in perfect order, and that'll be the end of it." "You're not worried at all, should I be? I literally helped write the codes they'll be checking against." She laughed, kissing my cheek. "I forget sometimes that you're kind of a big deal in the building code world. I prefer to think of myself as a medium deal, maybe medium large on good days." 2 days later, I received a formal notice from Boulder County Code Enforcement. An inspector would be coming to my property on Friday at 10 in the morning to investigate potential building code violations. The notice listed several alleged issues: improper setback from property lines, lack of required permits, potential structural safety concerns, and non-compliance with zoning regulations for auxiliary structures. I called the number on the notice and got through to the inspection department. A pleasant-sounding woman named Carol answered. "Hi, this is Wayne Owens. I received a notice about an inspection scheduled for Friday." "Yes, Mr. Owens. We received a complaint about an unpermitted structure on your property." "I understand. The structure is permitted, and I have all the documentation. I just wanted to know who's conducting the inspection." "Let me check. Looks like it'll be Inspector Rodriguez." I smiled. Dave Rodriguez and I had worked together on numerous code revision committees. He was one of the best inspectors in the state, thorough and fair. "Perfect. Thanks, Carol. No problem. If you have your permits and approved plans ready, the inspection should be quick." Friday morning arrived with clear skies and comfortable temperatures. I had my folder prepared with copies of everything: the HOA approval letter, the building permit, the engineered foundation drawings, material specifications, photos of the construction process, and even the structural calculations I had personally performed. I also included a copy of my state credentials, not to show off, but to provide context if questions arose about design choices. Dave Rodriguez arrived exactly at 10, climbing out of his county truck with his clipboard and digital tablet. He was in his mid-50s, with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who had spent decades working outdoors. "Wayne," he called out, genuine pleasure in his voice. "I should have known this was your place when I saw the address." "Dave, good to see you. How's the family?" "Everyone's great. My daughter just got accepted to CU Boulder for civil engineering." "That's fantastic. Tell her to look into the structural engineering program. Professor Martinez is still teaching and she's brilliant." "Will do." He glanced at his tablet. "So I got a complaint about this greenhouse. Says it's unpermitted and violates multiple codes. Come take a look." We walked to the backyard, and I watched Dave's expression as he studied the structure. He walked around it slowly, checking the foundation, the framing connections, the panel installations. He pulled out a laser measure and verified the setback distances. "Wayne, this is textbook. Actually, it's better than textbook. This is like a training example for how to build a residential greenhouse correctly." I handed him the folder. All the documentation. Permit was issued 8 weeks ago, approved by both the county and the HOA Architectural Review Board. Dave flipped through the papers, his eyebrows rising as he reviewed each document. "These structural calculations are impressive. Who did these?" "I did." "Right, of course you did," he laughed, shaking his head. "Who filed the complaint?" "Margaret Henderson. She's the HOA president." "Ah. Let me guess. She wasn't happy about something." "She was on vacation when the board approved it. She seems to think that invalidates the approval somehow." Dave made notes on his tablet. "The foundation exceeds minimum requirements. Your frost depth is textbook for this region. Anchor bolts are properly spaced and sized. Framing connections are solid. You've got proper cross bracing. Polycarbonate panels are UV resistant and properly sealed. Setbacks exceed requirements by a comfortable margin." He looked up at me. "Wayne, I literally can't find anything wrong with this." "It's perfect." "That's what I was hoping you'd say." "I'm going to write this up as a frivolous complaint. Everything is permitted, approved, and built to code. Actually above code. If someone files another complaint about this structure, it'll be flagged in our system as harassment." "I appreciate you being thorough, Dave." Are you kidding? This is the easiest inspection I'll do all month. Most people don't even know setback requirements exist, and here you are with engineered drawings and structural calculations. If anything, I should be taking pictures to use in training sessions. We chatted for a few more minutes about upcoming code revisions and some technical challenges Dave had encountered on recent projects. Before he left, he assured me I'd receive a formal clearance letter within a week stating that no violations were found and the structure met all applicable codes and regulations. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The following Tuesday, I received a certified letter from the Willow Creek Estates HOA. It was written on official letterhead and signed by Margaret Henderson in her capacity as HOA president. The letter stated that despite having received apparent approval from the Architectural Review Board, my greenhouse was retroactively deemed non-compliant with HOA aesthetic standards. I was given 30 days to either modify the structure to meet unspecified aesthetic requirements or remove it entirely. Failure to comply would result in daily fines of $100 and potential legal action. I read the letter 3 times, my jaw clenching tighter with each pass. This wasn't about building codes anymore. This was Margaret abusing her authority because I had dared to follow proper procedures without her personal blessing. Lisa read the letter when she got home, her face darkening with anger. She can't do this. We got approval. We followed every single rule. She thinks she can. The letter doesn't specify what's wrong or what modifications would satisfy her. It's completely arbitrary. What are you going to do? I'm going to the next HOA board meeting. This is going to get resolved one way or another. The HOA board met monthly in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. The next meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening. I cleared my schedule, prepared my documentation again, and showed up 15 minutes early. The community center's main room had about 30 chairs set up, though only a dozen residents were present when I arrived. The board sat at a long table facing the audience. Margaret in the center, with Tom Chen, the vice president, on her right, Treasurer Susan Williams on her left, and board members Patricia Moore and James Peterson flanking them. Margaret's expression soured when she saw me walk in. I took a seat in the front row and waited. The meeting began with mundane business, financial reports, landscape maintenance updates, and a discussion about repainting the neighborhood entrance sign. When they reached the section for homeowner comments, I raised my hand. "Yes, Wayne," Margaret said, her tone frosty. I stood, holding my folder. "I received a letter from you regarding my greenhouse. The letter states that my structure has been retroactively deemed non-compliant with aesthetic standards and that I need to modify or remove it within 30 days. That's correct. I'd like to understand the specific concerns. The structure was approved by this board 6 weeks ago. County Code Enforcement inspected it and found it fully compliant with all building codes. What aesthetic standards are allegedly being violated?" Margaret shuffled papers on the table, not looking at me. "The structure is too visible from neighboring properties and the street. It's an eyesore. The greenhouse is in my backyard, Margaret. It's not visible from the street at all. And the setback from neighboring properties exceeds requirements." "That's your opinion," she snapped. Tom, the vice president, cleared his throat. "Margaret, I need to interject here. I was present when Wayne's application was reviewed. The Architectural Review Committee approved it unanimously. The structure meets all our guidelines. I don't understand the basis for this retroactive rejection." Margaret's face flushed. "The board president has discretionary authority to review any approval for compliance with community standards." I pulled out my copy of the HOA bylaws, which I had thoroughly reviewed the night before. Actually, according to Article 7, Section 3 of the HOA bylaws, the board president can request a secondary review of architectural approvals, but only within 10 days of the initial approval, and only if there's evidence of procedural irregularities. It's been 6 weeks and there were no procedural irregularities. The approval is final. The room had gone completely silent. Several other board members were flipping through their own copies of the bylaws. Susan, the treasurer, looked up. "He's right. I'm looking at Section 3 right now. The 10-day window has long passed." Margaret slammed her hand on the table. "The greenhouse is still non-compliant. I don't care what the bylaws say." "You should care," I said quietly, "because the bylaws are legally binding. You're opening the HOA to liability if you attempt to enforce a decision that violates your own governing documents. Are you threatening the HOA with legal action?" "I'm stating facts. I'm a building code specialist for the state of Colorado. I literally write building codes. Every aspect of my greenhouse was designed to meet or exceed all applicable regulations. I obtained proper approvals through the correct channels. If you attempt to fine me or force removal of a legally permitted and approved structure, I will defend my property rights." "That's not a threat. It's a statement of intent." James Peterson, one of the board members, leaned forward. "Margaret, I think we need to table this discussion and have our HOA attorney review the situation. Wayne's correct about the bylaws. We can't just retroactively reject something that was properly approved." Margaret's hands were shaking with rage. "This board is supposed to maintain property values and aesthetic standards. If we let everyone build whatever they want, the neighborhood will look like a junkyard." "No one's talking about building whatever they want," Tom said. "Wayne followed the process. He submitted detailed plans. The architectural committee reviewed them and approved them. This isn't about aesthetics, Margaret. Be honest about what this is really about. What exactly are you implying?" "You're mad because the approval happened while you were on vacation. You feel like the board operated without your permission, but that's how boards work. We don't stop functioning because one member is absent." Several residents in the audience murmured agreement. Margaret looked around the room, realizing she was losing support. "Fine," she spat. "The letter is withdrawn. But don't think this is over, Mr. Owens. I'll be watching your property very carefully for any actual violations." "You do that," I said, sitting back down. The meeting continued, but the tension remained thick in the air. After the formal portion ended, several neighbors came up to me, expressing support and sharing their own stories of Margaret's overreach. Apparently, I wasn't the first homeowner she had targeted with arbitrary enforcement actions. Tom approached me as I was leaving. "Wayne, I'm sorry about all this. Margaret has been getting more difficult lately. Some of us on the board are concerned about her behavior." "Has she done this to others?" "Several times. She fined the Johnsons $200 last month because their mailbox was the wrong shade of black. It was black, just not the exact shade she thought it should be. She tried to make the Patels remove their vegetable garden because she said it was unsightly. She's also been selectively enforcing parking regulations, only ticketing cars she doesn't like. That's a pattern of abusive authority. I know, we're working on it. A few of us are considering calling for a vote of no confidence. Let me know if I can help. I'm happy to provide documentation of this incident." I drove home feeling better about the immediate situation but uneasy about what might come next. Margaret wasn't the type to let things go. She had backed down publicly, but that didn't mean she was done. My instincts proved correct the following week when I received another notice, this time from the city planning department. Someone had filed a complaint alleging that my property was being used for commercial agricultural production, without proper zoning permits. The complaint claimed I was growing produce for sale and operating an illegal business from my residential property. I called the planning department immediately and spoke with a zoning administrator named Richard. "Mr. Owens, we received a complaint that you're operating a commercial greenhouse business from your residence. That's completely false. I grow vegetables for personal consumption. I'm not selling anything." The complaint was quite detailed. It alleged that you've been seen loading large quantities of produce into your vehicle and that you've advertised your business on social media. None of that is true. I do take produce from my greenhouse to share with family and friends, but I've never sold a single tomato. And I have no business social media accounts related to gardening or produce. You have any proof that you're not selling? How exactly does someone prove a negative? I don't have business licenses because I don't have a business. I don't have sales records because I've never made sales. What I do have is a residential property where I grow food for my family. Richard sighed. Look, between you and me, this complaint seems questionable, but we're required to investigate. I'll need to schedule a site visit to verify land use. When works for you? How about next Tuesday afternoon? I'll be there. That evening, I started digging into property records and HOA complaint histories. I had friends at the county office who owed me favors from various code revision projects. One of them, Jennifer, worked in the records department. "Jen, I need to know who filed a zoning complaint about my property last week." "Wayne, you know I can't give out that information. Can you at least tell me if the complaint came from someone in my neighborhood?" There was a long pause. "Hypothetically, if someone wanted to know if a complaint came from an HOA president with a history of filing numerous complaints about her neighbors, what would you say?" "I'd say that person should be careful about filing false complaints. That's a misdemeanor in Colorado." "Hypothetically, of course. Of course." I spent the weekend documenting everything about my greenhouse operation. I took photos of the interior, showing my seedling trays, personal use vegetable plants, and complete absence of any commercial-scale production. I pulled up my bank records showing no income from produce sales. I even prepared a sworn affidavit stating that I grew food solely for personal consumption and occasional gifts to friends and family. Tuesday afternoon, Richard from planning arrived with a clipboard and camera. He was younger than I expected, probably in his early 30s, with a professional demeanor. "Mr. Owens, thanks for meeting with me." "No problem, let me show you around." We walked through the greenhouse together. Richard took photos and notes, asking questions about what I grew and what I did with the produce. I'm seeing tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, lettuce, herbs. All pretty standard home garden stuff. Where's the commercial operation? There isn't one. I grow food for my family. My wife and I eat fresh vegetables. I share extras with friends. That's it. The complaint alleged you were loading commercial quantities into your vehicle. I did load a bunch of tomatoes into my car last week. I took them to my sister's house because she was hosting a family dinner and wanted fresh tomatoes. I probably had 2 boxes worth. Is that commercial? Not even close. Richard made more notes. The complaint also mentioned social media advertising. I pulled out my phone. Here's my Facebook page. I post pictures of my garden sometimes because I'm proud of what I grow. But look, there's no pricing. No contact information for sales, no business page. Just a guy sharing pictures of his tomatoes. Richard reviewed several posts, nodding. Yeah, this is clearly personal. There's nothing commercial about this. So what happens now? I'm going to close the complaint as unfounded. There's no commercial operation here. You're using your property for residential purposes entirely consistent with zoning regulations." He looked at me seriously. "Mr. Owens, off the record, someone is harassing you. This complaint was deliberately misleading. If you get more complaints like this, you might want to consider filing a police report." I appreciate the advice. After Richard left, I sat in my greenhouse thinking about next steps. Margaret was escalating. First the code enforcement complaint, then the bogus HOA letter, now a false zoning complaint. Each one had been disproven, but she kept trying. She was hoping something would stick, or that I'd get frustrated and remove the greenhouse just to end the harassment. I pulled out my phone and called Tom, the HOA vice president. "Tom, it's Wayne Owens. We need to talk about Margaret. What's she done now?" I explained about the zoning complaint, how it was filled with false information, and how the planning department had determined it was unfounded harassment. "That's the third false complaint she's filed against me in 2 weeks. This has gone beyond HOA overreach. She's filing false government reports. That's illegal, isn't it?" "Yes. Filing a false report to a government agency is a Class 3 misdemeanor in Colorado. It's punishable by fines and potentially jail time." Tom was quiet for a moment. "Several other board members and I have been talking. We have enough votes to call a special meeting and vote on removing Margaret as president. Would you be willing to present documentation of her harassment at that meeting?" "Absolutely. Let me make some calls. I'll get back to you tomorrow." The special board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening. Tom sent notice to all board members and posted the agenda publicly, as required by HOA bylaws. The agenda listed discussion and potential action regarding board president conduct and possible removal from office. I spent the week preparing a comprehensive presentation. I organized every document: the initial code enforcement complaint, Dave Rodriguez's clearance letter, Margaret's retroactive rejection letter, the HOA bylaws showing she violated proper procedures, and documentation of the false zoning complaint. I also obtained statements from other neighbors who had been harassed by Margaret, with their permission. Thursday evening, the community center was packed. Word had spread through the neighborhood about the special meeting, and at least 40 residents showed up. Margaret sat at the board table, her face tight and angry. The other 4 board members looked uncomfortable but determined. Tom called the meeting to order. "We're here tonight to address concerns about actions taken by our board president, Margaret Henderson. These concerns include violation of HOA bylaws, harassment of homeowners, and potentially illegal conduct. Wayne Owens has prepared a presentation of the relevant facts." "Wayne." I stood and set up my laptop, projecting documents onto a screen I'd brought. For the next 20 minutes, I walked through the timeline of events, showing each complaint Margaret had filed, how each had been disproven, and how her actions violated HOA bylaws and potentially state law. "The pattern is clear," I concluded. "Mrs. Henderson has repeatedly filed false complaints and violated HOA procedures in an attempt to force removal of my legally permitted and approved greenhouse. More concerning, she filed a false report with the city planning department, making specific allegations she knew to be untrue. This isn't about protecting property values or maintaining community standards. This is personal harassment." Margaret jumped to her feet. "This is slander. You're attacking me because I'm trying to maintain the integrity of this neighborhood." "I'm presenting documented facts," I replied calmly. "Every document I've shown is authentic and verifiable." Susan, the treasurer, spoke up. "Margaret, I've been reviewing HOA complaints filed during your tenure as president. In the past 18 months, you've filed 47 complaints against homeowners." That's compared to a total of 12 complaints filed by all previous board presidents combined over the past 5 years. And 31 of your 47 complaints were determined to be without merit. Patricia Moore added, I've spoken with our HOA attorney about this situation. She advised that the board could be held liable for harassment if we don't address this pattern of behavior. She recommended immediate action to remove you from the presidency. You can't do this, Margaret said, her voice rising. I'm the president. I have authority to enforce HOA rules as I see fit. No, Tom said firmly. You have authority to enforce rules as specified in the bylaws. You've been violating those bylaws repeatedly. The board has a duty to all homeowners, not just to you. James Peterson made a formal motion. I move that Margaret Henderson be removed from her position as HOA board president, effective immediately, due to violations of HOA bylaws and conduct unbecoming of a board officer. I second the motion, Susan said. Tom looked at Margaret. Do you have anything to say before we vote? Margaret's face had gone from red to white. You're all going to regret this. Every single one of you. I'll sue the HOA. I'll sue each of you personally. I'll make your lives miserable. Threatening board members is also grounds for removal from the board entirely, Tom noted. Would anyone like to amend the motion to include removal from the board? So amended, James said. The vote was 4-0 in favor, with Margaret not voting due to the conflict of interest. Just like that, Margaret Henderson was no longer on the HOA board. She stood, grabbed her purse, and pointed at me. This is your fault. You think you're so smart with your codes and your regulations. You've ruined everything. I built a greenhouse, Margaret. You turned it into a crusade. She stormed out of the community center, slamming the door hard enough that the windows rattled. The room erupted in conversation. Several neighbors came up to shake my hand and thank me for standing up to Margaret. Others shared their own stories of her harassment, relieved that it was finally over. Tom approached me after things calmed down. Wayne, I can't thank you enough. We should have dealt with this months ago. I'm just glad it's resolved. There's one more thing. The board needs to select a new president. Would you be interested in serving? I laughed. No, thank you. I have enough on my plate with my actual job, but I appreciate the offer. Fair enough. We'll figure it out. I drove home that night feeling like a weight had been lifted. The greenhouse was safe. Margaret was no longer in a position of authority, and maybe the HOA could get back to its actual purpose of maintaining common areas and handling routine neighborhood business. I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. 3 days after the special meeting, I was in my home office working on revisions to the state's snow load requirements for commercial buildings when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find 2 Boulder police officers standing on my porch. Wayne Owens, the taller officer asked. That's me. I'm Officer Martinez. This is Officer Jackson. We need to talk to you about a complaint we received. My stomach sank. What kind of complaint? A neighbor reported that you threatened her at an HOA meeting and have been stalking her property. Let me guess. Margaret Henderson filed the complaint. Officer Martinez nodded. You know her, unfortunately. Can you come in? This is going to take some explanation. The officers followed me into my living room. I offered them coffee, which they declined, and then I pulled out my now substantial folder of documentation. Officers, Margaret Henderson has been harassing me for the past month. She's filed multiple false complaints about my property. The HOA board removed her from the presidency 3 days ago specifically because of this harassment. Now she's apparently trying to retaliate by filing false police reports. I walked them through everything, showing each complaint, each response from officials, and the documentation from the special board meeting. Officer Jackson took notes while Officer Martinez reviewed the documents. "This is pretty thorough documentation, Mr. Owens. I'm a building code specialist for the state. I'm used to keeping detailed records. Mrs. Henderson said you threatened to have her arrested at the meeting. I said her conduct might constitute filing false reports, which is a crime. That's a statement of fact, not a threat. She was the one who threatened to sue everyone right before she was removed from the board. There were 40 witnesses." Officer Martinez closed the folder. "Mr. Owens, it's pretty clear what's happening here. This is a civil dispute that's being weaponized with false police reports. We're going to close this complaint as unfounded. However, we're also going to have a conversation with Mrs. Henderson about filing false reports. If she continues, she could face charges." "I appreciate that." After the officers left, I called my friend Jennifer at the county records office again. "Jen, I need to know something. How many complaints has Margaret Henderson filed with various county departments in the past 2 years?" "Why do you ask?" "Police just left my house. She filed a false report claiming I threatened and stalked her. I'm wondering if there's a bigger pattern here." "Hold on, let me check something." I heard keyboard clicking. "Oh wow, Wayne, she's filed 63 complaints with various county departments in the past 2 years. Code enforcement, planning, environmental health, even animal control. The vast majority were closed as unfounded or frivolous." 63? That's more than one per week. "Yeah, and it looks like there's a flag in the system noting her as a frequent filer. When someone is flagged like that, complaints get extra scrutiny before action is taken. Can you email me a summary of that information?" "No specific details about other people's properties, just the number and outcomes of her complaints." "I can do that. Public record request form, I'll process it by end of day." That evening, I sat with Lisa and explained everything that had happened with the police visit. "She's not going to stop," Lisa said. "Even without the HOA presidency, she's going to keep coming after you." "I know. But now she's crossed a line into criminal behavior. False police reports aren't civil matters." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to file for a restraining order. And I'm going to provide the police with everything I have about her pattern of false complaints. They need to know she's abusing the system." The next morning, I went to the Boulder County Justice Center and filed for a civil protection order against Margaret Henderson. The filing required me to document specific incidents of harassment, which I did in detail. The clerk reviewed my application and supporting documentation. "This is one of the most thoroughly documented applications I've ever seen," she said. "You'll have a hearing date in about 2 weeks. The respondent will be served notice." "Thank you." I also stopped by the police department and asked to speak with someone about filing a formal complaint regarding false reports. I was directed to Detective Sarah Williams in the Criminal Investigations Division. Detective Williams was in her 40s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She listened as I explained the situation, reviewing the documents I provided. "Mr. Owens, you're describing a pattern of harassment using false government reports. That's something we take seriously because it wastes public resources and can harm innocent people." "That's exactly what's happening. I'm not her only victim. She's filed dozens of false complaints against neighbors over the past 2 years. Do you have contact information for other victims who might be willing to provide statements?" I pulled out a list of names and phone numbers. After the special HOA meeting, several neighbors had given me permission to share their information if it became necessary. These people have all experienced similar harassment from Mrs. Henderson. Some of them might be willing to talk to you. Detective Williams took the list. "I'm going to investigate this. If the pattern is as extensive as you're describing, we may bring charges." Filing a false report is a Class 3 misdemeanor. Multiple instances could result in more serious charges. I appreciate you looking into this. Over the next week, I learned that Detective Williams had contacted several of my neighbors. She also pulled records from code enforcement, planning, and other county departments. The investigation was moving forward. The hearing for the protection order was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon. I arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early, wearing a suit and carrying my folder of documentation. Margaret showed up 15 minutes before the hearing, accompanied by a lawyer. We sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, carefully avoiding eye contact. When our case was called, we entered a small courtroom where a judge sat behind the bench. "This is a hearing on a petition for civil protection order," the judge said. "Mr. Owens, you're the petitioner representing yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Mrs. Henderson, you're the respondent represented by counsel," Margaret's lawyer stood. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm Robert Sherman representing Mrs. Henderson." "Mr. Owens, please present your case." I stood and walked through the timeline of harassment, presenting each piece of documentation. I explained the false code enforcement complaint, the improper HOA actions, the false zoning complaint, and finally, the false police report. "Your Honor, this isn't a simple neighbor dispute. Mrs. Henderson has engaged in a systematic campaign of harassment using government agencies as weapons. She's filed false complaints with code enforcement, planning, and police. She's threatened me repeatedly. This behavior has disrupted my life and wasted substantial public resources." The judge reviewed my documents. "Mr. Sherman, your response," Margaret's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, my client was acting in her capacity as HOA president to enforce community standards. She disputes that any complaints were false. She believes Mr. Owens' greenhouse violates community aesthetics, and she was pursuing legitimate enforcement mechanisms." "Does your client dispute that she was removed from the HOA board for violations of HOA bylaws?" "She disputes the validity of that removal, Your Honor. She believes it was retaliation for her enforcement efforts." The judge looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Henderson, did you file a complaint with code enforcement regarding Mr. Owens' greenhouse?" "Yes," Margaret said. "It was an eyesore, and the code enforcement inspector found no violations." "Yes, but did you file a complaint with city planning alleging Mr. Owens was operating a commercial business?" "Yes, I believed he was selling produce, and that investigation found no evidence of commercial activity." Margaret hesitated. "Yes." "Did you file a police report claiming Mr. Owens threatened and stalked you?" "He did threaten me, at the HOA meeting." According to the police report, officers found no evidence supporting your claims. There were 40 witnesses at that meeting. None corroborated your version of events. Margaret's face was red again. Her lawyer put a hand on her arm, trying to calm her. The judge set down the documents. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm seeing a clear pattern here. You've filed multiple complaints that have been investigated and found to be without merit. You've continued this behavior even after being removed from your position as HOA president. That's harassment. I'm granting the protection order. You are to have no contact with Mr. Owens, directly or indirectly. You are not to file any further complaints about his property unless you have clear, documented evidence of an actual violation. This order is effective for 1 year." "Your Honor, that's," Margaret's lawyer started. "That's my ruling, counsel. If your client violates this order, she will face criminal contempt charges." We filed out of the courtroom. Margaret and her lawyer walked quickly toward the exit. I stayed behind to get a certified copy of the protection order. As I was leaving the courthouse, I saw Detective Williams in the hallway. Mr. Owens, good timing. I wanted to let you know that we're moving forward with charges against Mrs. Henderson. We've documented 5 separate instances of knowingly false reports filed with various government agencies. That's 5 counts of false reporting, each a Class 3 misdemeanor. When will charges be filed? The DA's office should have it by end of week. She'll be notified to appear for arraignment. I drove home feeling like maybe, finally, this nightmare was coming to an end. The protection order would keep Margaret away from me. The criminal charges would hold her accountable for her abuse of the system. The HOA had new leadership that was focused on reasonable governance rather than petty tyranny. Lisa was thrilled when I told her the news. Maybe we can finally just enjoy the greenhouse without drama. That's the plan. 2 weeks later, Margaret Henderson was arraigned on 5 counts of false reporting. She pleaded not guilty and was released on her own recognizance with conditions that included obeying the protection order and not filing any complaints with government agencies without first consulting her attorney. The case took several months to work through the system. During that time, I heard through neighborhood gossip that Margaret had put her house up for sale. She apparently couldn't stand living in a neighborhood where she no longer controlled the HOA and where her neighbors knew about her legal troubles. The new HOA president was Tom, who had been vice president. He ran the board efficiently and fairly, focusing on actual maintenance issues and treating homeowners with respect. The architectural review process became transparent and predictable. Several other homeowners built their own greenhouses after seeing mine, using my plans as templates. I spent more time working on my garden and less time dealing with HOA drama. The tomatoes that summer were spectacular. I grew 6 different varieties, plus peppers, cucumbers, lettuce, and herbs. Lisa and I ate fresh vegetables with almost every meal. In August, Margaret's case went to trial. She had rejected several plea offers, insisting she had done nothing wrong. The trial lasted 2 days. The prosecution presented testimony from code enforcement, planning department officials, police officers, and several neighbors. I testified about the pattern of harassment and the false reports. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 4 of the 5 counts. The judge sentenced Margaret to 60 days in jail, suspended, 1 year of probation, 200 hours of community service, and a $5,000 fine. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the county for the cost of investigating her false complaints. I wasn't in the courtroom for the sentencing, but Tom called me afterward to let me know. She looked devastated, he said. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Yeah, almost. Then I remembered all the people she harassed and all the time she wasted with her vendetta against you. Did she say anything? The judge asked if she wanted to make a statement. She said she was just trying to protect the neighborhood. She still doesn't think she did anything wrong. That bothered me more than anything else. Even after being removed from the board, facing criminal charges, being convicted and sentenced, Margaret still believed she was the victim. She couldn't see how her behavior had been abusive and illegal, but that wasn't my problem anymore. I had my greenhouse, my garden, and my peace of mind. The protection order was still in effect. Margaret's house sold in September, and she moved to some suburb of Denver. Life in Willow Creek Estates returned to normal. The HOA functioned the way it was supposed to, handling routine maintenance and occasionally reviewing architectural applications with reasonable standards. Neighbors waved when they saw each other. People complimented my greenhouse and asked gardening advice. One Saturday in October, I was harvesting the last of the season's tomatoes when my phone rang. It was Dave Rodriguez, the code enforcement inspector. Wayne, I'm calling with kind of an unusual request. What's up? I'm teaching a class at the community college on residential building codes and permits. Would you be willing to come speak to my students about proper permitting processes? Your greenhouse would be a perfect case study. Sure, I'd be happy to. Great. And maybe you could talk about what can go wrong when people don't follow procedures, and what can happen when neighbors abuse the complaint system. The Margaret situation. It's become kind of legendary in our office. We've actually changed some of our internal procedures because of it. We now flag serial complainants more quickly and require supervisor review of complaints from flagged individuals. That's a good policy change. I spoke to Dave's class a few weeks later. 20 students, mostly working adults pursuing careers in construction or planning, listened as I explained the greenhouse project from design through approval and construction. Then, I talked about Margaret's complaints and how the system handled them. The lesson here is that the code system works when people use it honestly, I told the class. Codes exist to ensure safety and reasonable community standards, but they can be weaponized by people acting in bad faith. When that happens, there are consequences, both civil and criminal. Building codes aren't tools for personal vendettas. They're public safety standards. One student raised her hand. What would you have done differently, honestly? Nothing. I followed every procedure correctly. I documented everything. That documentation protected me when I was falsely accused. The system worked eventually because I had proof of compliance. Another student asked, "Do you think the HOA president really believed your greenhouse was a violation, or was she just being vindictive?" I think she believed she had absolute authority to decide what was acceptable in the neighborhood. She couldn't differentiate between her personal preferences and actual rules. That's a dangerous combination when someone has even limited power over others. After the class, several students came up to thank me and ask additional questions. One young woman told me about her parents' experience with an aggressive HOA in their neighborhood. Stories like that were apparently common. Driving home, I reflected on how a simple greenhouse project had turned into months of conflict, legal proceedings, and eventually criminal charges against an HOA board president. I had just wanted to grow tomatoes, but maybe there was value in what had happened. Margaret's prosecution had sent a message that abusing government complaint systems had consequences. The HOA had reformed its procedures and become more accountable. The county had improved its handling of serial complainants. And maybe some of those students would remember the story and think twice before filing complaints in bad faith. Winter arrived in Boulder with early snow. My greenhouse kept producing cold, hardy crops like lettuce and spinach through November. I had installed a small heater for the coldest nights, enough to keep temperatures above freezing but not enough to trigger Margaret's old obsession with separate utilities. Lisa and I hosted Thanksgiving that year, and I made salads with lettuce from the greenhouse. My sister commented on how fresh everything tasted. "You know," she said, "when you first told me about building that greenhouse, I thought it was just a hobby project. I had no idea it would turn into such a drama." Neither did I. I just wanted fresh tomatoes. Was it worth it? All the stress and legal stuff. I looked out the kitchen window at the greenhouse, its lights glowing warmly in the evening darkness. Inside were rows of lettuce, spinach, and the beginnings of next spring's seedlings. "Yeah," I said, "it was worth it." Not just because of the vegetables, but because sometimes you have to stand up to bullies. If I had backed down, Margaret would have kept abusing her power. Other neighbors would have kept suffering under her arbitrary rules. Sometimes the right thing to do is the hard thing. That's very philosophical for someone who just wanted to grow tomatoes. I contain multitudes, she laughed, and we returned to the dinner preparations. Christmas came with more snow. The greenhouse was cozy despite the cold outside. I spent time planning next year's garden, selecting seed varieties and dreaming about spring planting. On New Year's Eve, Tom called with some HOA news. "Wayne, I wanted to let you know that we just finalized the insurance settlement." "What insurance settlement?" The HOA's liability insurance covered the legal fees and settlement costs related to Margaret's actions as board president. The insurance company investigated and determined that she had violated her duties as an officer, which triggered the policy coverage. They've also permanently banned her from serving on any HOA board in the future, at least for any property covered by their insurance. I didn't know insurance companies could do that. Neither did I. Apparently, she's now listed in a database of high-risk HOA board members. Any HOA she tried to join would see that flag. Good. Maybe it'll prevent her from doing this to someone else. That's the idea. Anyway, I wanted to thank you again for handling everything the way you did. Your documentation and professionalism made it possible for the board to take action. I just protected my greenhouse, Tom. You did more than that. You held someone accountable who really needed to be held accountable. As the new year began, I reflected on the entire experience. What had started as a hobby project had become a test of my patience, resolve, and understanding of the systems I worked with professionally. I had always known building codes from the technical side, writing regulations and reviewing compliance. But experiencing the code enforcement system as a citizen had given me new perspective. I understood now, in a visceral way, how vulnerable people felt when facing code complaints. Even when you've done everything right, the accusation alone creates stress and anxiety. The power imbalance between a complainant and the accused is significant, especially when the complainant is willing to lie. The experience influenced my work. When I reviewed proposed code changes or enforcement procedures, I thought about how they could be abused. I advocated for safeguards against frivolous complaints and for faster resolution processes when complaints were unfounded. I pushed for better documentation requirements for complainants, so they couldn't just make vague allegations without evidence. My colleagues noticed the change in my perspective. At a code revision committee meeting in February, I proposed new language for the complaint investigation process. We should require complainants to provide specific evidence supporting their allegations, I argued. Not just I think this is wrong, but I believe this violates Section X because of specific observation Y. It would reduce frivolous complaints and make investigations more efficient. Another committee member pushed back. Won't that discourage legitimate complaints from people who don't understand technical code language? We can provide guidance and templates. The point isn't to make it harder for legitimate concerns to be raised. The point is to prevent weaponization of the system. I've experienced firsthand how false complaints can waste everyone's time and harass innocent property owners. The committee eventually adopted a modified version of my proposal. It wasn't perfect, but it was an improvement. Spring arrived in Boulder with warming temperatures and longer days. I started my seedlings in the greenhouse, tiny tomato and pepper plants reaching toward the sun through the polycarbonate panels. Each year's garden was a new beginning, a chance to try different varieties and techniques. Lisa and I had developed a weekend routine of working in the greenhouse together. She wasn't as obsessed with gardening as I was, but she enjoyed the peaceful time spent nurturing plants and planning meals around what we would harvest. "You know what I love about this?" she said one Saturday morning as we transplanted seedlings. "It's just normal, No drama, no HOA conflicts, no legal issues, just gardening. That was always the plan. Margaret just provided an unwelcome detour. You ever wonder what she's doing now? Sometimes. I hope she's learned something from the experience, but I'm not optimistic. People like that rarely change. Maybe not, but at least she can't hurt people in this neighborhood anymore. In April, I received a letter from the Colorado Department of Local Affairs, my employer. They were giving me an award for outstanding service in building code development and education. The citation mentioned my work on code revisions, my teaching and outreach efforts, and my contributions to improving code enforcement procedures. At the award ceremony, my supervisor made a speech. "Wayne Owens exemplifies what it means to be a public servant," he said. "He doesn't just write codes, he helps people understand them. He doesn't just enforce regulations, he improves the system to make it fairer and more effective. His work has made Colorado's building code system more accessible and more resistant to abuse." I felt awkward being praised like that, but also proud. The work mattered. The codes mattered. Making sure they were fair and properly enforced mattered. Summer arrived with perfect growing weather. My greenhouse produced an abundance of tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. I gave away bags of produce to neighbors, who reciprocated with baked goods and dinner invitations. The neighborhood felt like a real community, the way it was supposed to. One evening in July, I was watering plants when I heard someone call my name. I looked up to see a young couple standing at the edge of my yard. "Sorry to bother you," the man said. "We're looking at buying a house in the neighborhood. Someone mentioned you had experience with the HOA here." Unfortunately, yes. But the experience was mostly about dealing with a problem that's been resolved. "We've heard HOAs can be really difficult. Is this one reasonable?" It is now. New leadership focused on actual community maintenance rather than petty rule enforcement. "They're not perfect, but they're fair." The woman looked at my greenhouse. "That's beautiful. Would we be able to build something like that?" "Absolutely. Just follow the architectural review process, submit proper plans, and get your permits." The current board is reasonable about approving projects that follow the rules. "That's good to know. Thank you." They walked away, and I returned to my watering. It felt good to be able to recommend the neighborhood and the HOA honestly. Things had changed for the better. As summer faded into fall, I found myself thinking about the full cycle of seasons since the greenhouse conflict had begun. A year earlier, I had been dealing with Margaret's harassment and false complaints. Now, I was harvesting the last tomatoes of the season, planning next year's garden, and enjoying my home without constant drama. The greenhouse stood as it always had, solid and functional, producing food and providing a peaceful space for me to work with plants and soil. It represented more than just a garden structure. It was proof that following the rules, documenting everything, and standing firm against unreasonable opposition actually worked. In October, I received a notification that the civil protection order against Margaret was expiring. I could renew it or let it lapse. I decided to let it lapse. She had moved away, completed her probation requirements, and as far as I knew, hadn't caused any more problems. Holding on to the protection order felt like holding on to the conflict itself. Tom called me that same week with interesting news. "Wayne, the HOA membership just voted to adopt new bylaws. One of the changes is a limit on how many complaints any single board member can file. It's being called the Henderson Rule." Is that a good thing? It's a practical thing. It prevents what happened with Margaret from happening again. Board members can still file legitimate complaints, but there's oversight now if someone starts filing excessively. That seems reasonable. The new bylaws also created an ombudsman position. Any homeowner who feels they're being unfairly targeted can request review by an independent party. It's all because of what happened with you. I'm glad something positive came from it. Thanksgiving came around again, and once more I harvested lettuce from the greenhouse for our family dinner. This time, nobody asked about HOA drama. That chapter had closed. Winter returned to Boulder with snow and cold. The greenhouse kept producing through the shorter days. I installed grow lights this year, extending the growing season even further. On a quiet evening in December, I sat in the greenhouse with a cup of coffee, surrounded by winter lettuce and planning documents for next year's garden. The space was warm and peaceful, lit by the grow lights and the reflection of snow outside. I thought about everything that had happened since I built this structure. The initial excitement of construction, Margaret's harassment, the complaints and investigations, the board meetings and court proceedings, and finally the resolution and return to normal life. The greenhouse had been tested in ways I never anticipated, not just structurally, but legally and politically. It had withstood every challenge because it was built right from the beginning, because I had followed every rule, and because I had the knowledge and resources to defend it. But most of all, it had withstood because it was worth defending, not just as a structure, but as a principle. People should be able to use their property reasonably without facing harassment. Rules should be enforced fairly, not weaponized for personal grudges. Authority should come with accountability. Those principles mattered. They had mattered when I built the greenhouse, when I fought Margaret's complaints, when I testified in court, and when I worked to improve the building code system itself. Lisa came out to the greenhouse wrapped in a winter coat. "It's peaceful out here," she said, sitting next to me. "It really is. Any regrets about building this, about all the conflict?" "No regrets. If I had known what would happen, I might have approached some things differently. But I wouldn't have not built it. This greenhouse has given us fresh food, a peaceful hobby, and eventually some positive changes to how the HOA and code enforcement work. And a good story. That too." We sat together in the warm greenhouse while snow fell outside, planning next year's garden and enjoying the simple pleasure of a space we had created and defended. The conflict with Margaret felt distant now, a closed chapter in our neighborhood's history, but the lessons remained. Stand up for what's right, follow the rules and document everything. Don't let bullies abuse their authority. Systems work when good people insist they work fairly. Those lessons had value beyond my personal situation. They applied to building codes, HOA governance, community relationships, and the basic social contract that makes neighborhoods function. As the year drew to a close, I felt grateful. Grateful for my greenhouse, my garden, my wife, and my community. Grateful that when tested, the systems designed to protect fairness actually worked. Grateful that standing firm against unreasonable opposition had led to positive changes that would benefit others. The greenhouse stood as it always had, solid and productive, a testament to proper planning, correct procedures, and the willingness to defend what you've built. In the end, that was all it had ever been meant to be.